Good evening. Hello. On behalf of the ULCC Library Committee's Literary Subcommittee, welcome to Cocktails and Conversations with Chicago Authors. And tonight we're featuring Miles Harvey and Charles Baxter. Before we get started, I want you all to know how much we appreciate your support of our literary programming. And we look forward to bringing more to you on topics of interest in the future. We're always interested in your ideas and interests, so please do not hesitate to contact me at librarian@ulcc.org. I would also like to encourage you to purchase books from Chicago's independent bookstores. The books for tonight's program can be purchased online from the bookseller in Lincoln Square. We welcome questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A during and after the program. We'll try to get to as many as possible. So I'd like to go ahead with introductions. I'm so very pleased to be introducing these two fabulous writers. Miles, you have the home court advantage, so you're going to go first. Miles Harvey is the author of the national and international bestseller, The Island of Lost Maps, and the recipient of a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship at the University of Michigan. His book, Painter in a Savage Land, was named a Chicago Tribune Best Book of the Year and a Booklist Editor's Choice. His most recent release is one of the books we'll be discussing tonight, The King of Confidence, a tale of utopian dreamers, frontier schemers, true believers, false prophets, and the murder of an American monarch. Our copy is checked out, so I couldn't hold it up. Miles teaches creative writing at DePaul University in Chicago, where he's founding editor of Big Shoulders Books. He has his degree in journalism from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MFA in English from the University of Michigan, where he was a student of our other panelist, Charles Baxter. Charles Baxter is the author of The Feast of Love, a National Book Award finalist. He also wrote First Light, Saul and Patsy, Shadow Play, The Soul Thief, and his recently released novel, The Sun Collective. And I do have a copy of that. Good. Nice. He has published 7 story collections. Most recently, There's Something I Want You to Do, which won the Minnesota Book Award for Fiction. Charles is well known for his essays on the writing craft and has also published 3 volumes of poetry. In addition to numerous writing awards, Charles is revered and respected by his students. When I was looking for information for this intro, this quote popped up at me. One of his students saying, "When I arrived here, he was welcoming, open, kind, and somehow I knew then, as I know now, that it would be my great good luck in life to have had him as a teacher. He didn't treat those of us in his classes like his students. He treated us like the writers we so wanted to be." Wow, that's a great tribute. A graduate of Macalester College in St. Paul, Charles received his PhD in English from the University of Buffalo. He lives in Minneapolis and is recently retired from teaching creative writing at the University of Minnesota and the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. So welcome to you both. I'm really excited for you to get on with your conversation. So I'm going to step back, turn off my camera, and let you all talk.
Thanks so much, Cheryl.
Thank you. Miles, do you want to start or shall I?
Charlie, I'll start just by saying that when I was reading The Sun Collective, I kept having a shudder of kind of recognition. And it just struck me that you and I have been asking the same questions and answering them in very different ways and in different forms, but there was so much thematic overlap with both these books.
Yes, I think so too. I think it would probably be best for our audience if I gave a very quick rundown of what's in the Sun Collective, just so we know what the basic ground situation is in the novel. And then we can talk back and forth about our books and the interrelation between the themes in them. The plot of my novel is a kind of convergence narrative. There are essentially two threads that come from two different sets of characters. The first ones that we're introduced to are people of late middle age, my age, Harry and Alma Bredigan, and they have one daughter who's a veterinarian and a son who has been an actor. He's been an actor in Chicago, actually, but he has disappeared more or less. He's living deliberately on the streets. They don't know where he is. His parents don't know where he is. And so they spend a fair amount of time searching around Minneapolis looking for him. And in the course of one of his searches, his father, Harry, runs into a number of street people, homeless people. And in one conversation with the homeless guy, Harry learns that the homeless people believe that there is a group called the Sandmen who are coming in from the suburbs and assaulting, or in some sense, killing homeless people and vagrants. And Harry says, "Oh no, this is a rumor. It's not true." And the homeless guy says, "No, you don't know what you're talking about. These things are really going on." In the second strand of the book, there is a counterpointed couple, uh, two young people, Christina Lobdell and her boyfriend, who goes under the name of Ludlow. And they are, as we discover, they become adherents to a group called the Sun Collective, which is a kind of amorphous neighborhood group that begins with rehabilitation of street people, community gardens, free stores, and then branches out into a kind of co-op movement. And it is Ludlow and his participation in the Sun Collective that is primarily the engine of the second half of the novel, because he's not a liberal, he's a kind of revolutionary, and he has violence in mind. And Christina comes to think that it is her task to intervene before any real damage is done. So that's the broad outline of my novel. And right at the center of it is the Sun Collective. And I think probably Miles and I are going to be talking a fair amount about expectations that people have when they go into groups like the Sun Collective, or the group that forms around the central character of Miles's nonfiction history.
Yeah, I've come to think of my book since reading yours, Charlie, as the Strang Collective, right? So
Yeah.
my book is also about this utopian impulse in American culture. I think that that's something that we really share. I wrote about a guy named James Jesse Strang, who in the 1840s and 1850s was sort of made his own utopia, first in southern Wisconsin, and or utopian colony, and later on Beaver Island in northernmost Michigan, Lake Michigan, where he in 1850 declared himself the king of earth and heaven, and among other things set up a pirate colony. Charlie, how did you come to this material? What was the inspiration for this stuff?
Well, I knew that you were going to ask me that question, and I've tried to sort it out, because I did work on this book 4 or 5 years, and I can hardly remember what got me started, but I do remember 2 or 3 things. One was that I found myself getting most of my exercise by walking around downtown Minneapolis, and I had a lot of conversations with street people. And much of what they had to say, I thought was just flabbergasting. I felt like going home and writing down immediately some of the things that they had said. And a few of the dialogue sections in my book are more or less verbatim conversations that I had with these guys. Nearly all of them are guys, a few women. That was one strand. The second strand, and I'll try to make this quick, is that Minneapolis has had a fascinating history of radical politics. And particularly in 1934, there was a general strike in the city with communists, mostly followers of Trotsky, in the truckers union, and another group, the Citizens League, that was basically firing on them. A number of people were killed. There was a fascist movement, the Silver Shirts, that also had power in the city. And all of that got mixed up with what I was reading about the way that political thinking was evolving or devolving on the internet. That people were, it seemed to me, beginning to take rumor as truth. And I thought that's very interesting. And I began to devise a narrative in which the what we call the information age is gradually supplanted by what I call the disinformation age.
I mean,
yeah. So those are the elements.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, I wrote about a time where truth becomes very porous as well, and I think,
right.
And it was, as I read in the book, a kind of information age in and of itself, kind of very, I wouldn't call it an information superhighway, but it was an information communications revolution that allowed the con man / prophet at the center of my book, who was also a journalist, to project himself into the world from this tiny little island in Lake Michigan. And so, you know, this whole idea of malleable truth is, I think, a really interesting and important subject now. And I want to get into it more. Charlie, would you mind reading us something?
I'd be happy to. As I pull the pages out, maybe you could tell us what sent you in the direction of straying. How did you discover him?
Well, so, I mean, in one way, it was similar to you. I happened to be, I have a brother-in-law and a good friend who happens to live in Burlington, Wisconsin, which when I do a very short little reading, I'll read about. It's a couple hours northwest of Chicago. And I was up visiting with him and his parents one day, and he started driving me around and showing me these buildings and telling me this incredible story about this spin-off Mormon utopian colony that had been there and their leader. But I didn't think much about it until, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, when an editor from Little Brown contacted my agent and said, can I talk to this guy about an idea I have? And of course, the story goes from there, Charlie. But it was I was skeptical about someone else suggesting a story to me, but when I started looking into it for reasons I can talk about, it was just an amazing.
Well, it's such a great story, and it's about faith, and it's about con men, and I hope we got to talk about this, the sort of thing that people go to con men for, the things that they believe or want to believe. I'll just read a very short passage from the book. Christina is in the leader of the Sun Collective is a somewhat mysterious, odd guy who goes under the name of Y. he's very hard to see. His eyes are sensitive and he tends to only show up when it's dark. And he has wanted to meet her in the Como Park Zoo in St. Paul in the middle of winter in a snowstorm. And he's told her that they should meet in front of the wolf cage. The animal appeared to be thinking. What, Christina wondered, was it worrying about? Maybe the problem it was trying to solve was, what am I doing here? How did I get here? How do I get out? But Christina projected her thoughts into the wolf's mind, and thoughts from the wolf came back to her. There must be an answer, the wolf believed. For a minute, looking at the height of the fencing, Christina imagined herself inside the enclosure and the wolf outside, free. On this side of the cage, only half visible in the storm, stood Y. He wore a bright blue parka matted with snow, thick mittens, and a woolen cap on which snow had already accumulated. His dark glasses, the ones he customarily wore, had a curtain of snow over them, and more snow was accumulating in his straggly beard. He looked like a sage in disguise, a snow-bespeckled shaman. As Christina approached him, she heard him muttering instructions to the wolves. This is where the magic happens, Y said, studying the pacing wolf. What magic? Christina asked. I don't see any magic. You have come here, Y continued, still not turning around to acknowledge her. It was one of his gifts to know when people were near him, given his creepy, extra sensitive human radar. You have come here to ask about your boyfriend, Ludlow, and about the other one, Timothy. Yes, she said. How did you know? Wolves don't like human beings. Did you know that? Y asked. They detest and avoid us. They can't stand the way we smell. Our smell offends them. Even when starving, they will not come into a city. All at once, he let out a whistle, followed by a high keening cry, and I, that made both wolves regard him slowly and suspiciously, as if he'd spoken the password but mispronounced it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of candy, a Skittle, but instead of feeding it to the wolf, he popped it into his mouth. It was a territorial gesture. Why? Christina said. I think Ludlow is in some kind of trouble, and oh, he's not in trouble, Christina dear. Don't you worry. Anyway, I wouldn't call it trouble. I think he's constructing a bomb or something. The alpha wolf was still approaching the two of them, seemingly not afraid.
Wow. That's such an amazing scene, Charlie. I mean, well, I want to ask you about Christina in just a second, but why did you select that setting? It's so haunting, this whole moment. This woman is coming to this, I didn't know if you'd call him a cult leader, but her guru in some way,
yeah.
To report that basically that she thinks her boyfriend is a terrorist.
Right.
Why this setting?
I can, it's a great question. I'll try to answer it quickly. I believe in the principle of getting characters out of the house and into a setting where somehow the setting is answering back the emotions that they're having. And anybody who lives in the Twin Cities knows that the zoo is open 365 days of the year, even in a blizzard. And I went over there while I was working on this book to see if I could see the wolves in the midst of a snowstorm. And sure enough, you can't. But there's something uncanny about the scene. That's what I wanted. And it seems to me that when you have a character in a novel or a short story exchange a glance with an animal, that recognition between man and animal, it sets up a certain vibration in the scene that suggests something big or terrible is going to happen. So I tried to get her in front of some animals.
And of course, in that scene, there's just this moment where it's snowing and all Christina can see is this white wolf's gray eyes. It is
That's
so
right.
haunting, Charlie. I want to ask
That's
you
right.
about Christina too, because she's a really interesting character. She is someone who finds herself falling harder and harder under the spell of this group.
Mhm.
Very cult-like qualities, but she has one foot in the very normal world. But early in the book, she describes her life as wispy and thin and uninspiring, and that she wanted a life that was as real as the one that was not as real as the one she currently had. There's this
Yeah.
sense of unreality that
Yeah.
strikes different characters in your book different
Right.
ways. And I wonder if you could talk about that and just sort of like what the personal implications of that and the political implications of it are.
Yeah. Well, when I was thinking about Christina, I was thinking of a lot of the students I've had and the young people I've known who are wonderfully intelligent, uh, terrifically educated. They are knowledgeable in all kinds of fields and are underemployed, so that they have these gifts of intelligence and training, and it turns out that they're gifts that nobody wants. So she is feeling that what she really wants or needs is a challenge. She needs a task. She needs to she's been trained in deconstruction, which she's very good at, but it's not what she wants to do. And she wants to be an instrument for good in the world. And at the Sun Collective, she's welcomed as a human being. As she says, she's not just another virtual person on the internet. Um, but I mean, this can get us into something else and something related to your book. Uh, I think she feels also that the world that she has entered with Ludlow and with the Sun Collective is not as real as she thought it would be,
Hmm.
and has been taken over by fantasists. This is where I want to lead back to your book and something our books have in common. Um, Strang had quite a following out there on Beaver Island, and actually before he got there. And I think a lot of your readers, or a lot of the people watching this, are likely to wonder, what did they want from him? What did they, why did they think that only he, of all the people in 1848 Midwestern America, that he was the one who could give them what they felt they needed?
Well, yeah, maybe I'll read a very short section too, but this is something that was really central to what I was asking about in the book. And I think part of the answer is the mid-19th century was a time of just massive upheaval, a technological, political, spiritual, and
Yeah.
demographic. People suddenly
Mhm.
didn't know their neighbors.
Mhm.
It was a nation of strangers suddenly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'll just read a couple of paragraphs about just the utopian impulses. And I think
Mhm.
we also live in a utopian time. I mean, I think sometimes we don't think of it that way because the utopian promises are often on the right in our current age instead of on
Yeah.
the left.
Yeah.
But I think the kind of yearning for meaning is there. So I'll just read. This
Mhm.
is about Strang's first colony, which is in Burlington, Wisconsin, as I said. He set it up in 1845, and he called the place Voree, which he translated to Garden of Peace. So Strang's Garden of Peace began to take root in an age when America was teeming with utopian experiments. We are a little wild here with numberless projects of social reform, the essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson had joked to a Scottish friend in 1840. Not a reading man, but has a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket. Just 100 miles to the north of Ori, for example, was a colony called Ceresco, one of 23 loosely affiliated socialist communes scattered throughout the United States, all of them inspired by the French utopian philosopher Charles Fourier. Our ulterior aim, wrote one member of one such commune in 1844, is nothing less than heaven on earth, the conversion of this globe, now exhaling pestilential vapors and possessed by unnatural climates, into an abode of beauty and health. As for James Jesse Strang's own version of utopia, he offered his followers, many of whom were losers in the mid-19th century economic, demographic, and social convulsions, a sense of belonging and purpose, a belief that they alone could purify an unclean world and that he alone could show them how. He furnished them with simple solutions to their problems, scapegoats for their miseries, assuring them, for instance, that their enemies within the Mormon church were, quote unquote, corrupt usurpers. Theirs, he insisted, was a righteous victimization. It was hardly possible at this time, he maintained, to serve God faithfully until one has become thoroughly reconciled to live and die hated. He promised his followers that they would one day rule the world. And so I think that was just a very attractive thing to a lot of Americans. I'm wondering whether some of the people who joined the Sun Collective were inspired by similar impulses.
Well, I think there has been, as you point out, a long strain of utopian thinking in America. The Shaker Colony, the Oneida Colony, Brook Farm, what is it, New Harmony in Indiana. But when I was walking around this afternoon thinking about your book, one of the thoughts that occurred to me is that we have to be careful when we say what people were expecting from Strang or what people were expecting from the Sun Collective. I think it's important to bring in gender questions here, because you pay a lot of attention to the way women were treated in Strang's community. And in my novel, I tried to pay attention to what men were doing as opposed to what the women were doing. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the colony was really progressive in certain ways. With Strang, there's always this mix of idealism and opportunism, I think, and both were real. He was, for instance, a true abolitionist, but he also, I wouldn't call him progressive about women's issues, but in some ways he was ahead of his time. For instance, women on the island all wore pantaloons or were ordered to wear pantaloons. And eventually this was brought along Strang's downfall. There was, it sort of was like masks in our own time, Charlie. It became a political symbol, and Strang tried to assert his power with this. But all that being said, women were wearing pantaloons a year before Amelia Bloomer famously donned bloomers. And so in some ways it was very progressive. The gender issues in general in the 19th century were kind of completely fascinating to me. This was a time where people, there was this sort of marked presentation of femininity. And at one point, Strang traveled the country for months and months with a person he identified as his nephew and private secretary, who was in fact his secret second wife in men's clothing. And of course, some people identified her as that, but many people didn't. And I think it's just that the signifiers for femininity were so ornate that people didn't weren't willing to accept that someone in men's clothes was actually a woman. And so, yeah, that was a really fun part about researching this book. Yeah. Charlie, I wanted to ask you, in the quote I read, there's that bit about where someone from one of the mid 19th century utopian colonies talks about, heaven on earth. And this is a theme that's really resonant in your book. As one of your characters in the book declares, the kingdom of God is here now. I mean, what does he mean by that?
Well, at the most obvious level, he's saying that the kingdom of God is not something that we will only see after we die, and that it is somewhere else. I mean, he's essentially making a case for an immanent world infused by divinity, that it is a way of looking at the world and saying that everything is connected, everything is part of the design plan, and that to that extent, striving to achieve the kingdom of God may be a mistake. When I was in graduate school, one of the poets in the program was a poet named Robert Creeley, and he had a little poem which went more or less also the way that he read. The kingdom of God is here now. That was the poem. And I think because a novel has to have a dramatic structure, you have to bring, again, in a form of counterpointed characterization, characters who believe that the kingdom of God is here now, which is partly what Alma thinks and partly what Christina thinks, versus Ludlow, who believes that you have to blow things up and eradicate the elements of the present in order to get, in a way that, say, Lenin would agree with in State and Revolution, that you have to blow things up in order to make a new present possible, that the kingdom of God is over there and you have to bring it here. But the only way to do that is by violence.
And of course, the book I wrote about, this was also a time and a people who thought they were bringing around a kingdom of God. That we forget this now, or some of us forget this now, that Latter-day Saints were called Latter-days because they thought they were in the last days, and that they were bringing about the second coming. And Strang's followers many of them were true believers, but this led them to commit all sorts of criminal acts, right? They basically set up a pirate colony on this island. I got to say, Charlie, I want to ask you about this. I've never been much of a utopian thinker. I was when I worked at the Socialist News magazine. I was not. I was considered a liberal, this made researching utopian thinking of this time really made me dislike the idea of utopias even more. I was wondering what if it had the same effect on you.
Oh, absolutely. And when I was writing the book, I came to a point where I thought, I am going to have to write a manifesto that represents the belief system of the Sun Collective. And the primary belief, according to the Sun Collective manifesto, is no more utopias. No more utopias. There's been too much historical bloodletting in the name of utopia, and we renounce all utopias. And yet, there is much to be done. And one of the things that they believe in is that we will recover our sense of the kingdom of God if we learn to unconsume. They they have a saying that a specter is haunting America, the specter of anti-consumerism, and their whole manifesto is a kind of mirror image of the Communist Manifesto, as you know, and what they say is that they, in a sense, they're Luddites, because actually I think this is one of the ways that revolution may go if automation continues in the way that I think it's going to continue. It's going to put more and more workers out of work, and you're going to have something that looks like a Luddite revolution. So that's part of their manifesto as well.
You know, it's funny, this manifesto, there's this phrase that appears in both our books, twisted in your book.
Yeah.
So the Communist Manifesto was written during Strang's time. And there's this wonderful phrase in the Communist Manifesto that I quote in the book, because I think Marx and Engels were really getting at something that was going on in that time in a way that I didn't understand before. And that phrase is, all that is solid melts into air.
It's a great phrase.
That struck me as the phrase for that time period. You know, in some presentations, I put a picture of Marx and a picture of P.T. Barnum up side by side, because this is a period we get the word confidence man. There's just a sense of incredible unreality in the mid-19th century. And so I loved when I was reading the Sun Collective's manifesto, and there's this phrase that you use, twisting Marx and Engels, and it's all that is airy melts into dogma. Can you explain what that means?
All that is airy solidifies into dogma.
Yes.
So when Marx and Engels say all that is solid melts into air, they're trying to, or they are expressing the feeling that many people in the mid-19th century had, which was that nobody had ever seen social changes like the ones that were going on. And it was as if the feudal arrangements, the local way of doing things, the movement to the cities, the factories, nobody knew what was happening, and nobody knew what had happened to the values that they had once held on to. All that was solid is just melting into the air. My characters, the Sun Collectivists, have turned it around and say all that is airy solidifies into dogma, meaning gossip and rumor and things that you read on the internet are turning into principles that people in power are getting up and saying and claiming. And so this is a basis for the Sun Collective trying to convince people to get off their cell phones, to close down their computers, because they believe that Google, for example, is just one vast surveillance system. But I mean, the main point of it, though, is that somehow gossip and rumor and speculation and fantasy, which are taking the place of truth, are also being turned into dogma. That's what they believe.
I mean, and obviously that's a very appropriate line to This Week in the News, for instance. I mean, you know, with my book, I don't mention 2020. I make two very oblique references to the current moment. One is in the prologue and one is in the final line of the book, but they're not direct. I don't mention the Trump era or anything like that. But from the start, people have sort of read the book, and I get a lot of emails about it, as a kind of allegory for our present moment. And I don't mind that, partly because I wrote the book in the present moment, and I think it would have been a different book if I'd written it at a different time. But I'm wondering, Charlie, like, to what degree were you trying to capture the zeitgeist or make sense of the zeitgeist?
Well, I was thinking a great deal about this when I started the book, and the opening chapter begins with the kind of ordinary guy, Harry Bredigan, getting on an actual commuter train, the Blue Line light rail in Minneapolis, going out to the airport. These are all signs of realism. But as I worked on the book, uh, because I was writing during the last 4 or 5 years, I began to think that what I wanted to express, I couldn't express using the techniques of realism. I couldn't write the kind of book I wanted to write in the way that, say, Edith Wharton or Henry James or even Joseph Conrad would have written them. I had to have something else. And the reason, I thought, is that realism as a literary form only makes sense if there's general agreement about what reality is.
Hmm.
If there's no general agreement about what reality is, then probably realism as a literary form isn't going to bring us the news of what it feels like to be in an era when half of what we are told may come from a kind of wish or a fantasy. So I felt that my book had to have, this is going to be a kind of broken metaphor, had to have one foot in realism and one foot in Wonderland. Wonderland being a place that is governed by possible truth, not actual truth, in which delusion has as much of a place in thinking as understanding does.
And I think when we say delusion, we think of it, and maybe not in the current era, but I think I've always thought of it as sort of, something that's not real. Like delusion is the opposite of real. But
Yeah.
delusion, when sustained by a group of people, this is something I get out of my book. There was absolutely no reason past a certain point to believe in Strang, except that people wanted to believe in him. And I talk about, cognitive dissonance in this book, where you readjust your logic system, where you find out something about him. But one of the things that I came away with, that like illusion is a very powerful, palpable thing, and it's a very seductive thing, that people get very angry when they're told you can't have that beautiful lie.
I was going to go back to this question of why people wanted to believe him so much. Had he been making promises to them? I mention this because many people have been watching on HBO this series called The Vow, about this guy, Keith Raniere, and his group Nexium, which was a kind of cult, and in which women, again, were abused. So you think about him, and you think about the followers of Strang. What was it they wanted to believe? I know I've asked you this question before, but it's still puzzles me.
I think it's tricky, because I think, like, the members of the cult you just described, when you see that guy's picture in the paper, you don't think, what a shockingly handsome man. I can see why he drew a huge crowd around him. Strang was short and bald and a little weird looking, and he was, so one of the things, but he had an ability to, he had confidence. I mean, this was the era in which we get the term the confidence man, and he exuded a certain kind of thing that made people believe in him. One of the things, and it gets me to a question I want to ask about you. This was the era of self-made men, and and it was a big thing in the United States, and it was a big trope.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Strang was the ultimate self-made man. You know, one of the cool things about him is we have his diaries from when he was a teenager and in his early 20s. And he had what he called dreams of royalty and power. He dreamed about being this thing, and then he made it real. And I think his ability to fictionalize himself drew other people to him in a way. And he also just made it out of words. He was a really good kind of didactic writer. Not one that you would want to workshop in one of your classes, Charlie, too much, but you would say those sentences hold together pretty well. And I guess I'd ask the same thing about you. Like, why did these people, what drew them?
Well, my friend Joan Silber, who has written wonderful books, once said to me, the power of a con is not its plausibility. The power of a con has to do with how much people want to believe it. And so the question almost always comes back to, what do I think I am going to get out of this? More freedom, more power, love, so, you know, the basic things, but also something that is very much a part of any group, and a cult, a sense of belonging. And so in my novel, I made a point every time that Christina goes to the Sun Collective meetings, she feels, I'm welcome here. They understand me. They love me here. That's very seductive.
Yeah. Especially in a world where people feel estranged.
Yes.
Alienated.
Yeah. Atomized, yes.
Yeah.
So are you all ready to maybe break for questions?
Yes.
Okay. We have Allison, who says this might be a little cheeky, but I wonder if the two of you might be willing to reminisce together a little bit about working together as professor and student.
Well, I'll grab that one. Cheryl, the piece you read at the beginning was just so spot on. Charlie was just in terms of craft, what we learned from him was amazing. You know, there's this writer's workshop, and a lot of times that's bullshit. It's sort of based on the Renaissance idea that the younger artisan can learn from the more experienced artisan. But with Charlie, but he also just he showed us how to exist in the world as a creative person. And I think that part about just being respected, you know, there's this, in one of his books, there's a moment in which a stupid grad student asks him a stupid question in one of his craft books. I think if I would have done that, I would have said a grad student asked me a question. But every few years, one of my undergraduates comes running into my office and says, "You're in Charles Baxter's book," you know.
Yes.
It was, and I just when I saw that, you know, he had no reason to put my name in the book. And Miles Harvey asked me this interesting question in class one day.
You remember the question? It was a great question. The question was, Charlie, why are there so few antagonists in the stories that we write? It was brilliant. In fact, if you go to graduate school, MFA programs, and you read one story after another, you think, are there any antagonists? These stories are just full of main characters who are not, I mean, there are no antagonists in them. And I just thought it was a brilliant question. And I'll just say very quickly that Miles was part of an astounding group of writers, including people who we have become one another's lifelong friends. Michael Paternitti, Cami McGovern, William Lychak. These are all wonderful writers. There were others also in the group. I couldn't have been luckier to have these people around.
Well, we feel the same way, Charlie. And Cheryl, let me put in a really quick plug for the woman who asked that question, Alison Swan, who was one of our colleagues.
Who was also my student.
She was a poet, and she now has a collection of poetry out. That's pretty wonderful.
Oh, nice.
So I just want to mention her.
Well,
Wonderful poet.
I'm working on a poetry program, so maybe we should be in touch. So,
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Bob Joy has a question. Do you believe that times of great technological change serve as a breeding ground for cults?
What a great question. And I would have to probably, to answer it properly, I would have to have half an hour, and all I have is a minute. But my feeling is that in periods of a great technological change, the sort of ontological insecurity that results primarily among those who are less equipped to understand and to manage and to handle those changes, meaning people who are 50 and older. In that group, of which I'm a member, the sense of all that is solid is melting into the air. Things that you once knew how to do. You knew how to change a tire, you knew how to turn the TV on, you could raise the hood of your truck, and with some luck, you could fix it. You can't do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. The things that once gave you value in the world. I mean, I could no more tune up my car than I could go to the moon. When I first started driving in the 60s, cars were so simple that anybody could learn how to tune them. But I think older people have become a kind of joke because they can't get the technology. But it's a serious business when a large sector of the population simply can't catch up with the rate of change. And they're going to get upset and angry about it.
I agree with that. And I would say that even for people who aren't losers in those kind of times. So for instance, the time Strang lived, this is the period where we just have the photograph, the telegraph, and the railroad. And so our basic relations to time and space are completely altered. And I think even for people who embrace those technologies, there's a sense of alienation and a weirdness. Marx, again, he said, and Engels, all fast frozen relations are swept away. I'll add one more thing to that too. I think that often the people who thrive as con men in these periods are the people who are just a little bit ahead of everyone technologically. Strang was brilliant at exploiting this communications revolution that was happening, and he understood it better than other people did. I think of, there's a guy named Dr. Brinkley. There's a great book by a guy named Pope Brock called Charlatan that talks about this guy from the 20s and 30s who was the famous goat gland doctor. He literally sewed goat gonads into tens of thousands of American men who were worried about their virility. He was a classic con man. He made millions off of it. What he was also is one of the true pioneers of early radio. He understood that from Kansas and later from a pirate Mexican station, he could reach people across the country. And I think whatever else you think about President Trump, he understood better than anyone who came before him that Twitter could do a bypass on traditional media and that he could reach people without needing to get ABC News or CNN happy about it. So I do think technology plays a big role in all this stuff.
Yeah.
So we have another question. Okay, and Rachel, I'm sorry, I'm going to mangle your name. It's Rachel Swearingen. And did I get it?
Also has a new exciting book out.
Right? No
Yes.
Kidding. Which absolutely haunts me every day. So she asked, what was there anything that was surprisingly difficult about writing your books?
I always have a great deal of trouble. This I'm afraid is not a terribly interesting answer, but I've never been strong with plot, and so what's difficult for me is getting the structure, the parts of the book to um, coalesce, to meet each other, so that it doesn't look as if I've spent a lot of time just hammering and sawing and trying to get parts of it together. The other part of my book that I had some particular difficulty with were the meetings of the Sun Collective, because I couldn't be too detailed about what they were up to without making them seem as if they could be summarized very easily. So I tried to keep it kind of fuzzy, a little hard to see. Those passages took me a long time to write.
I'd just like to say, Charlie, that I think, dare I say it, there's the plot in this is so propulsive. It's got a thriller quality to it. I mean, this is one and perhaps the only one of your books, maybe The Soul Thief, but that Hitchcock could direct. You know, I mean, honestly, it's just, there are some, I was breathless as the book moved on, it has your usual meditation on theme and incredible characters and scenes. So I think it's superb. As far as I'm going to answer a weird way to this question, to say, like, I struggle so much. I'm such a slow writer and not the brightest human being in the world. I always say that I'm bright only in slow motion, right? If I can mull something over, you know, I'm not a dummy, but I don't, you know, I'm not going to win Jeopardy anytime soon. But this book, and maybe it's just the point I'm at in my career, Charlie, I remember you telling me this a few years back, where I kind of knew what to do with the material earlier than I usually do. I usually wrestle with it, and I'm in a writers group that's really helpful, and I have other writers. You mentioned William Lychak and Mike Paterniti, are people I just trust with my prose. Cammy McGovern. I just had some great writers who helped me out with this. A guy named Scott Blackwood, and so this one was not. It took me a long time, because everything takes me a long time, but it came easier than some for me, and I think it may just be where I am in my career now, or in my knowledge of how to handle material.
Yeah.
Let's take one more. Actually, this is Cammy. She says, Charlie, would you mind talking a little more about your main character, Bredigan, and how you see his journey over the course of the book?
Well, I'm going to cheat on the answer, because I got a wonderful email from Cammy yesterday, who asked or pointed out something to me that I had only half recognized, which is that when we see Bredigan, he's often on a train going from one world to the next, from downtown Minneapolis out to the Utopia Mall and back from the Utopia Mall to Minneapolis, or he's traveling around in the dark at night. And it's a small part of his biography that he happens to be a structural engineer and bridge designer. It's partly convenient because my son is a structural engineer and a bridge designer. So whenever I needed some technical details, I could consult with my son. But as Bredigan is dying, I hope I'm not giving too much away. As he's dying, he imagines a bridge that he would like to build for everybody, for all the shades, to get from this world to the next one. He closed his eyes and thought of a bridge he would design for her, for all of them. Her is a poor lady he has seen on the train. It would be a pedestrian bridge formed by slender and heavily post-tensioned concrete decks, the cables anchored to stiff foundations at either end. To support the deck, the post-tensioning cables would exert large historical forces at the abutments, suited to locations where the ground consisted of solid rock. The ribbon bridge that Bredigan saw in his imagination would be well suited to a river. He saw all of them, the shadows, crossing over on his bridge to rest in the shade of the trees. That last sentence, let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees, are the dying words of Stonewall Jackson. The rest of the paragraph is Bredigan's fantasy of his bridge, and I didn't write it. My son wrote it. He wrote that paragraph.
Wow.
Wow.
I said, this man is dying. He imagines a bridge for pedestrians to get into the next world. Please design it for me. And that was his bridge.
Well, on that, I want to thank both of you so much for taking the time to do this and for a fantastic conversation. When we're open and people can come into the club, I hope you'll come and we'll raise a glass or two or three.
Yeah.
There's a nice bar in that club, Charlie. We should take her up on it.
Okay,
There
we'll
is.
do it. Yeah. Well,
So-
thank you and to the club for setting this up. Thank you,
Well,
Cheryl.
I really, really appreciate your time. And I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. And I hope you all have a good evening.
Mhm.
Cheryl, can I just do a quick hard sell pitch for Charlie's book? It's wonderful. Christmas is coming up. Buy it. You won't go wrong.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right.
And
Thanks so
also,
much.
yes.
And the King of Confidence. Yes, absolutely. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.